Chobits is a classic manga that has seemingly lost its popularity over the years. While still well known, it is not nearly as revered as it once was in the mid to late 2000s, nor are many new fans seeking it out. I believe this is the case in due part to the anime adaptation made by Madhouse. Despite my own appreciation of the adaptation, it suffers from meandering pacing and early digital animation. Regardless, I liked it when I watched it in 2016, 5 years ago as of writing. Still, I was curious as to how the original manga held up. For what it's worth, I was a big fan of the anime and wanted to see if the manga could do it even better. Having now read it, I can safely say that I thoroughly enjoyed the Chobits manga, even more than the anime. Sci-fi was all the rage in the 1990s, in both halves of the world. In the Western Hemisphere, The Matrix made a mainstream audience question the validity of their own existence, Jurassic Park brought dinosaurs back to life through genetic mutation, and the Japanese pop culture icon Godzilla was bastardized in the American self-titled Godzilla. The same was true in Japan. Sci-fi had been booming. With the rise of Mobile Suit Gundam and Akira a decade prior, the 1990s biggest titles were dominated by sci-fi themes. Perhaps the most notable and most vital to Chobits was Mamoru Oshii's 1995 film Ghost in the Shell, which explored robotic augmentation, the human soul, and the ties between the two. The film is smothered in a dark and foreboding atmosphere, one that is quite uncomfortable. In contrast, Chobits entered the scene 5 years later, at the tail end of the sci-fi craze, as a total departure from the cynical and somber sci-fi set by Ghost in the Shell and its contemporaries. While Chobits explores similar ideas, such as the existence of a human soul in a robotic body, it stands apart from the rest in its supporting genres: slice of life, romance, drama, and comedy. Rather than a bleak examination of whether a character has a human soul, the story of Chobits follows the blossoming relationship between a human and his Persicom, this world's version of a robot. In tone, the story has blotches of darker plot points, but these moments often come across as tender rather than oppressive. Reading Chobits is often fun, pleasant, and joyful, ways I would never describe most of the sci-fi that preceded it. Without abandoning the questions that make sci-fi, specifically about robots, compelling, Chobits is far more digestible. On the contrary, those questions are served in a way that is more fun to engage with. This is highlighted in the supporting cast, who manage to be fairly endearing in both characterization and their individual stories. Its goofy antics might be a bit much for a reader that's looking for a more straight-faced take on sci-fi, but for other readers, Chobits' lighthearted nature might be the perfect way to experience these kind of themes. On the whole, Chobits is quite palatable in the ways it communicates its ideas to the reader. In that sense, I think that's why it was so successful at the time it released. Compared to what came before, it was a breath of fresh air. It proved that this type of story can have different inflections. Since then, stories about robots and romance have become somewhat more available, but despite its declining uniqueness, I still think Chobits has a place in sci-fi manga. One of my favorite things about Chobits, and something that sets it apart from a lot of other stories about robots, is the time frame of its technology. It's fairly uncommon to find a story about robots that are far from perfection. Usually robots are portrayed as near perfect with maybe a single major flaw to create a narrative. Comparatively, the Persicoms of Chobits are primitive. They seem human-like, but the manga often reminds us that their programming is far from a human mind. Their emotions, thoughts, and personalities are all programmed and, by extension, not real. A perfect example is the quote-unquote laptop Persicom, Plum. Her personality is overly energetic, but that is only because she was programmed that way by her owner. For as loud as her personality is, it is just as simple. She is devoid of complex emotion or thoughts, even more so than full-size Persicoms. She never expresses worry, sadness, or any other negative emotion because she wasn't programmed with those emotions in mind. Even the more complex Persicoms only express an emotion in the sense that their programming determines how they feel. Unlike similar stories, Persicoms do not have emotion comparable to humans. That much is directly stated. It isn't a question that leaves room for interpretation. The emotions of Persicoms, even Chobits, are merely programmed. Instead of asking if the emotions of Persicoms are real, the question is it okay to love a Persicom even if they are fake? The Persicoms are limited to their devices, and the human characters have to decide what that means to them personally. While not as prevalent as the conversation of emotion, another aspect of the technology that I found interesting was the mechanical side of how the Persicoms worked. It's clear that the bodies of the Persicoms are not perfect. One arc in particular, my favorite of the entire manga, features a character who deals with his Persicom spelling systems, which begins to develop as memory problems, similar to Alzheimer's in humans. Not unlike humans, Persicoms are not immortal beings that will never falter. Each model is eventually outdated, their software will become unsupported, and their hardware can simply break down. Persicoms have an unspecified lifespan, just as all modern technology does. If anything, the Persicoms feel more human than most fictional robots because of how flawed their bodies can be. As I mentioned before, some of Chobits can come off as a little goofy, and I can't deny it, some of it is a bit much even for me. Obviously, comedy plays a part in that, but it's irrelevant to the larger problem. My one major criticism of Chobits is its technology can be totally nonsensical. Ranging from Persicoms seemingly replacing computers for most people to a startup button being in a vagina. Some of the tech of this world is hard to take seriously. Of course, the manga was released in 2000, a different time from today, and should be taken with a grain of salt. However, there's still a handful of technological ideas that made little sense even when publishing. This does not mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it does occasionally pull me out of the reading experience. The cast of Chobits is defined by the ways in which they develop the overarching purpose of the manga, which is to explore the validity of loving a Persicom. Likewise, Chobits ventures into each character's perspective of what it means to love, their relationships with Persicoms, and how that ties into the story of Hideki, the protagonist, and Shi, his Persicom. Any character that has an active role in the story has a new point of view to add, a new way to understand the way we coexist with robots. Whether romantic or platonic, each character's arc tackles a different problem. One character may struggle with their inferiority complex towards Persicoms, while another may have to cope with the reality of their Persicom's technological limitations. Because each character's feelings are so fleshed out, the pros and cons of having relationships with Persicoms are explored in a relatively satisfying way. This extends beyond the relationships between humans and Persicoms, however. The manga actively makes mention of the ways in which Persicoms have changed relationships between people, some of which are relevant to the various characters. Hideki notices on multiple occasions just how few people are without Persicoms in public. Nearly everyone relies on Persicoms to some extent. Although reliance on Persicoms is becoming the social standard, there is a darker underbelly to the existence of Persicoms in a human society. One character, for instance, had previously gone through a divorce because their husband had become obsessed with their Persicom. Chobits actively makes the effort to showcase why Persicoms are helpful to society, but never chooses to ignore why they could potentially be dangerous to the well-being of human relationships. Each character tells their own story, but the full picture comes across as cautiously optimistic towards robots becoming a part of their world. I went into Chobits manga not knowing that it was any different than the anime. While fairly similar in most regards, minus the rearrangement of plot points, the most notable difference is the ending. Whereas the anime ends with Shi's program seemingly giving Persicoms emotion, though it is somewhat vague, the manga ends with the affirmation that their emotions are not real, and Hideki's choice to remain with Shi despite that. Personally, I prefer the ending of the manga because it stays true to the core themes of Chobits. While not quite as uplifting, I think it brings a much more satisfying resolve to Hideki's choice. After everything he's seen and heard, all the experiences of the people he knows, he still defies the logical choice and chooses to become the one for Chi. It suggests that it is up to the reader if his decision is correct or not. Hideki merely chooses what he believes will bring him and Chi happiness, and if Chi really cannot feel happiness, then he will feel it for her. It is a perfect way to close out the story. It's realistic and beautiful at the same time. I appreciate what the anime attempted to do, but I feel this overall is a stronger way to tie everything together. Personally, I love Chobits. I see it as an underrated manga these days. Often forgotten about when discussing classic manga, I wanted to attempt to give it a little more love. Is it as deep and complex as Ghost in the Shell? Is it a perfect masterpiece? Is it timeless, unsubjected to changing technology? No, no, and no. Is it good? Absolutely. In the midst of its light fan service and dumb comedy, I think a lot of readers fail to see how compelling it can be. From its heartwarming romance to its engaging themes, Chobits offers a multitude of reasons to read it even 21 years later. Hey, thanks so much for watching the video. I know it's been a little while since I made one of these. It's been like 3 years, but I've been in, a different place in my life. I started college and now I'm almost done with my associate's degree as of this semester. And as far as creative stuff goes, I shifted focus to my artwork. I'm currently working on releasing a webcomic. I've been learning animation, and in general I try to post illustrations over on my Instagram and Twitter. So give those a check if you're interested at all. It would mean the world to me. And as far as videos go, I have no idea what I'm going to be doing in the near future, but maybe I'll be coming back and making more videos. It's something I actually do want to do, so maybe instead of making 30 or 40 minute analysis like I used to do, we'll do some like 10 to 15 minute videos that are more focused on something, like I did today. But that's for a later date. As for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.